When you think like a CEO, when you feel like a CEO, when you treat yourself with the respect and seriousness of a CEO, you will naturally up-level the way that you are contributing and the voice that you are bringing to the room. You watch yourself showing up like a badass. You watch yourself being the person in the room who isn't afraid to ask the question that everyone is thinking. That is what will make you unstoppable in a room. That is what will grow your confidence. That is what will accelerate your career path. And that is what will shape you as a leader. Welcome to The Art of Speaking Up, a podcast that helps professional women access the limitless potential that lies within them. I'm your host, Jessica Guzik, and my mission is to help you find that spark inside you that has the power to transform your career in ways you may not have thought possible. I'm so excited that you're here. And now, on to the show. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited for this episode because I am teaching a concept that I have never taught before, never talked about before, and it is hugely important when it comes to you finding your voice, becoming a powerful presence in the room, and really solidifying your reputation as a leader. So you are tuning into part 2 of the CEO Mindset, CEO Voice series. And the premise behind this series is that one of the fastest, most effective ways to develop a confident, effective, standout voice in the room is to focus first and foremost on internal transformation as opposed to external transformation. So internal transformation is when we work on transforming our confidence, our identity, our thoughts about ourselves, whereas external transformation is when we focus on transforming our external habits and capabilities. So an example of that would be learning to express an idea in a more concise way, learning to assert a suggestion in a way that's going to sound more persuasive. Those are external transformations. And what I find so often is that when people are working on developing a stronger, more effective voice in the room, they do focus a lot on external transformations, and people tend to under-index on internal transformations. They tend to underestimate just how much a shift in identity and an increase in self-confidence can naturally and organically improve your verbal communication without you even trying. And the premise of this series is that if you walk into a work meeting and you feel like a leader deep in your bones, you're not just walking into that meeting casually, sitting back, sort of half in, half out. You are walking in ready, focused, committed, and taking that conversation as seriously as you would take it if you were the CEO of your company. The premise of today's episode is that if you walked into that meeting with that energy, and that was the only variable you changed, it would have an enormous impact on your presence in the room, and everyone around you would feel it. When you think like a CEO, when you feel like a CEO, when you treat yourself with the respect and seriousness of a CEO, you will naturally up-level the way that you are contributing and the voice that you are bringing to the room. And in today's episode, I'm supporting you in one key area that is going to help you think more like a CEO. I am teaching you some of the differences between a way a CEO would be thinking in a meeting versus a way just, an individual contributor would be thinking in a meeting. Because if you can start thinking the way the CEO would be thinking, then you will naturally start speaking the way a CEO would be speaking. And as a result, people are going to perceive you as a more confident, capable leader and a far more powerful voice in the room. In today's episode, that is what we are going to be working on together. And before I dive deeper and start to walk you through the teachings, I have a quick but time-sensitive announcement, which is that enrollment is open now through July 2nd for my signature group program, The Art of Speaking Up Academy. This program is for you if you are ready to develop a verbal communication style that is confident, crisp, compelling, and that propels your career and your reputation to greater heights. The Art of Speaking Up Academy is a curriculum-based small group coaching program where I support you in elevating your verbal communication, not just by learning surface level tactics, but by transforming and growing your confidence on the inside. If you are itching to feel more capable inside, to feel stronger about yourself and your talents so that you have the courage to bring your voice out more frequently and powerfully at work, this is the program for you. You will get to do the inner work in addition to learning and practicing the fundamentals of crisp, compelling verbal communication. And you will get to do it in a setting where you are instructed live by me every single week, and you're surrounded by women who share the same goals and dreams as you. So you're going to get that inspirational accountability that you need to fuel up and stay committed to your growth. And you're going to get the curriculum and step-by-step guidance that you need to grow your confidence and your communication skills in a way that actually sticks and in a way that is lasting and sustainable. To come join us in the next cohort, head to jessguzikcoaching.com/academy and submit your application by July 2nd. If you have questions, shoot me a note at jessica@theartofspeakingup.com. I will put all of that information in the show notes, and I can't wait to read your application and support you inside. And now, let's get deeper into the episode. Okay, so the first thing that I want to cover are the 3 ways that you can add value for your company. And I want to talk about the differences between how someone in an individual contributor mindset would try to add value versus how someone in a CEO or leadership mindset would try to add value. So the 3 ways that you can add value to your company are as follows. Number 1 is through workload. Number 2 is through intellectual load. And number 3 is through emotional load. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain to you what each of those things is. And then I'm going to highlight a super important key difference in how a leader would approach those 3 things and how you want to be approaching those 3 things. Okay. So the first way that you can add value for your company is through workload. This literally means taking on part of the workload, executing, doing what needs to be done. There's a certain amount of things that have to get done. And one way that we can add value is by raising our hand and volunteering to do those things. As you can probably imagine, and as you might anticipate where I'm headed with this, workload is a very individual contributor way of adding value within a company. The second way you can add value within a company is through what I call intellectual load. Intellectual load is different from workload in that it's not about you just taking on more work and doing and doing and doing. It's about you using your brain, your thinking, your problem solving, and your intellectual capacity to help solve problems. And one of the places where it is most important for you to take on some of the intellectual load is during work meetings and conversations when everyone is talking about something and working on something together. Now, this is what I talked about in part 1 of the CEO Mindset, CEO Voice series. I talked about this idea that just because someone in the room has more years of experience than you or more knowledge than you doesn't mean you can't help with the thinking and the problem solving. Doesn't mean you should put all of the burden of the intellectual load on the people in the room who have the most years of experience. Generally, it is going to be beneficial for your company if you are helping carry some of the weight of the intellectual load. So this means that when you enter into a meeting room, you are thinking about how can I help with the problem solving? How can I help with the thinking that is going to be happening in this room? Now, the pivot from workload to intellectual load represents pivoting from an individual contributor mindset towards a more CEO mindset. An individual contributor is going to be thinking like, what can I do? What task can I take on? What can I raise my hand to help with? Whereas a leader, a CEO is thinking, how can I use my thought process, my intellect, and my problem solving to help us move things forward? And so that pivot from you focusing on taking on all the workload and just doing, to you focusing on helping with the intellectual load and you helping to contribute thoughts and ideas and solutions is a really important ingredient in you developing as a leader. Now, if you want to go deeper into that shift, listen to part 1 of this series, because part 1 is all about helping you to really understand why it is so important for you to take on more of the intellectual load. And what I also want to offer is that when you take on more of the intellectual load versus just workload, this is when your reputation really starts to grow. It's really hard to distinguish yourself at a company when you are only taking on workload. If you are only taking on workload, then you develop a reputation as someone who works really hard and does a lot. And when a company has someone who works really hard and does a lot, and that's what they're known for, what do you think that company is going to want to do with that particular employee? Have them work more, have them continue doing a lot, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you become known as someone who does a lot, then your company is going to want you to do a lot. Whereas if you start taking on more of the intellectual load in work conversations and meetings, then you become known as a problem solver and a thought leader. You become known as someone who has good ideas, who can generate solutions, who can come up with new paths forward. And unlike someone who has a reputation for just doing tons and tons of work, when you have a reputation as a thought leader and a really solid thinker, then your company is going to say, okay, we want to put her in the places that require the deepest, most sophisticated thinking. And typically those places are leadership positions. Leadership positions tend to need people who can take on a lot of intellectual load and who can problem solve at a deeper level. Because when you're in a leadership position, you're setting higher level direction, and then you have a team of people who are helping you with the workload and the execution. So as a leader, it's not about being good at doing, and taking on all the workload. It's about being stronger at taking on the intellectual load. Now, that being said, it doesn't end there, because remember, I mentioned there were 3 things: workload, intellectual load, and emotional load. And what I want to focus on in this episode is emotional load. And you're probably like, what the heck is that? I'm going to explain it. But the reason that I want to focus on it is because it's something that most people aren't aware of, and something that I see most people approaching backwards and literally approaching it in a way that is harming their career and harming their efforts to build self-confidence, and they don't even realize it. So I want to talk about what emotional load is. Then I want to talk about the difference between how an individual contributor approaches emotional load versus how a leader approaches emotional load. Okay, so what is emotional load? Emotional load is the burden of the uncomfortable emotions that have to be felt in order to create something remarkable. This never gets talked about, but this is probably like one of the most important things I can share with you in terms of your professional success. So if you're working on something or your company's working on something, typically it's not just about the workload and doing. And it's not even just about the intellectual load, solving all the problems and answering all the hard questions. But I think what we forget and what we don't realize is that achieving something also requires us to bear an emotional load. In order for us to achieve something challenging, we have to be willing to feel a whole bunch of uncomfortable feelings like frustration, right? Maybe the thing that we are trying to do isn't straightforward and we keep on running into obstacles. We have to be willing to feel the emotion of frustration to stick with it and get it over the finish line. Another difficult feeling that might come with accomplishing something big is feeling vulnerable or feeling potentially judged by other people. If we want to accomplish something big, we have to put new ideas out there for people to react to. We have to put ourselves out there and put our thinking out there. And when we do that, we can feel emotionally vulnerable. So some examples of this are, if a company is starting a new initiative, in the early conversations of starting that initiative, in order to get the ball rolling, people might have to start putting out like mediocre ideas just to get something on paper and to get things moving. Another example is if you really want to properly create something spectacular, you might have to ask quote unquote stupid questions so that the key pieces of that project are being clarified for everyone in the room. And what these examples are meant to illustrate is that creating something excellent and achieving a significant impact for your company isn't just about showing up, doing the work, and using your brain to solve problems. It's about being willing to feel the unpleasant emotions, the frustration, the vulnerability, the fear of judgment that comes when you truly give it your all and you're truly giving your all to a challenging piece of work or a challenging problem that your company is trying to solve. And typically in most corporate cultures and in the world we live in, we don't talk about emotional load. Typically, the conversation in a corporate environment is going to center mostly around the workload and then a little bit around the intellectual load. People are going to be talking about how much work it is, how long it's going to take to get done. People also are going to be talking about how challenging some of the obstacles are. But you're not going to hear people having a lot of dialogue around how emotionally uncomfortable it has been to accomplish that particular piece of work or that particular mission. And what this can lead to is you feeling like something is wrong with you when you experience emotional discomfort as a result of working on something big or something challenging. That being said, emotional discomfort is an unavoidable part of any big, high-impact piece of work. So the point that I'm really wanting to make here is just like workload and just like intellectual load, emotional load is a natural part of achieving something significant. There will be an emotional load that comes with it. Now, I want to share with you the key mindset shift from individual contributor thinking to CEO thinking that will lead you to have a way more valuable voice and presence in the room. This is going to be a game changer. When you are in an individual contributor mindset and you are in a work conversation or meeting, typically you are operating, often subconsciously, but typically you are operating off of the goal of keeping your emotional load as low and small as possible. In other words, you walk into a work meeting or conversation, and in the back of your mind, one of the things that you're thinking is, how can I avoid embarrassing myself? How can I avoid looking stupid? How can I avoid sharing a wrong suggestion? So you're asking yourself all of these questions that are designed to minimize the emotional load that you have to take on when you are in that conversation. Now, that being said, the emotional load has to get taken on by someone. If no one in a room and no one at a company is ever willing to ask a stupid question or embarrass themselves or share a suggestion that might be a little bit out there, if 0 people are willing to do it, it is going to be very hard to get bigger, more challenging initiatives across the line. This is why a leader comes in with the opposite mindset. Instead of them coming into a room thinking, how can I minimize my emotional load? How can I avoid feeling embarrassed? How can I avoid sharing something dumb? A leader is thinking the exact opposite. A leader is thinking, how can I take on as much emotional load as possible? How can I ask the quote unquote stupid questions that need to get asked so that we can move forward? How can I share the quote unquote out there crazy suggestions that need to be added to the mix so that we can develop our thinking? How can I be the voice in the room who is unencumbered by the fear of looking stupid, because that fear is going to prevent us from executing in the way that we want to? A leader understands what is required to get complex things over the line, and their decision-making process is all about how they can show up to maximize the likelihood that that complicated thing is able to get over the line. And because emotional load is a part of that process, rather than avoiding taking it on, they are going in wanting to embrace taking on emotional load. And as a result, they are able to have a much bigger impact in a room, because instead of them solving for contributing the least, they are solving for contributing the most. I really want you to think about this mindset and apply it to workload, because when you apply it to workload, I think it'll click for you how important it is to shift into that CEO way of thinking. So I want you to think about workload, and I want you to think about an employee who is like, okay, my goal is to literally do as little as possible. I want to give the minimum. I want to do the minimum. And I'm constantly spending all of my energy making sure that I do as little work as possible. Versus an employee who's like, I want to help as much as possible. I want to use all my energy to figure out how I can help as much as physically possible. Now, the point of this example is not to say that you have to do this. And it's not to say that your value to your company comes from you overworking and taking on all of the projects. That is not what this example is for. In fact, it's the opposite. For you to move into leadership roles, you have to move away from overworking and more into leading. But the reason I share this example is because we can see how detrimental it could theoretically be if someone is approaching workload with this idea and attitude of like, oh, I want to take on as little of it as possible. And yet when it comes to emotional load, this is often the mindset we go into meetings with, and we have normalized that mindset because we've been doing it for so long. But you would probably never approach your workload with the thought of like, I want to do as little as possible. And so you also don't want to approach emotional load with the thought, I want to do as little as possible. And what I want you to think about in today's episode is I want you to think about whether you're approaching the emotional load with the mindset of a CEO or not. A CEO is determined to get results and do whatever is necessary to get results. And if taking on part of the emotional load is one of the things that will help get results, they are going to be willing to do that. I know that from the outside, executives and CEOs look so smart and they look like they have it all together and they look like they're never embarrassing themselves. But the truth is they are willing to not look smart. They are willing to embarrass themselves because that is what's required for them to drive impact. And if no one else is willing to take on the emotional load, they have to be the ones to do it. They can't just sit by and let a piece of work stagnate or let a piece of work not reach its full potential because they don't want someone to judge them for asking a stupid question, or they don't want someone to judge them for sharing an idea that doesn't make sense. They're not making decisions based on avoiding judgment by other people. They're making decisions based on being as helpful and valuable as possible in the room. And that includes taking on part of the emotional load. So what I want to push you to do in today's episode is I want you to treat emotional load as being as important and vital for the success of your work and your team's mission as you treat the actual workload. Because what I find is so many women are treating their workload with so much importance and so much sanctity, and they hit every deadline and they're willing to put the time and the energy in, but they're not applying that same focus and that same determination to emotional load. They're not thinking, how can I be braver in this room so that I can make a bigger impact? And ultimately, when you start doing that and when you make the shift to taking on more of the emotional load, what happens is, number one, you end up having more impact because you're asking the questions you need to ask, you're contributing the ideas that you have, and over time, that has a real impact on the work that you're doing. And number two, as you take on more of the emotional load, it grows your confidence. You watch yourself showing up like a badass. You watch yourself being the person in the room who isn't afraid to ask the question that everyone is thinking. And as you see that, you start to grow your own respect for yourself and you start to feel really unstoppable inside for having so much inner resilience. And finally, when you're willing to take on more of the emotional load, your path to leadership accelerates. One of the most powerful traits that you can bring to your company is being unafraid to speak up and unafraid to use your voice to help get everyone to the next step. That courage and that willingness to take on that emotional load is wildly valuable to your company because nearly any big initiative that is going to be handled at the leadership level is going to require courage, is going to require boldness, is going to involve an emotional load. And what companies need most at the leadership level are people who are willing and able to take on that emotional load. They don't need people who are willing to take on a ton of workload. They need people who can go beyond workload and even beyond intellectual load and who can take on the emotional load. That is what will make you unstoppable in a room. That is what will grow your confidence. That is what will accelerate your career path. And that is what will shape you as a leader. So in summary, there are 3 ways that you can add value at your company: through workload, through intellectual load, and through emotional load. And one of the key shifts that you want to make so that you can have a CEO mindset and therefore speak with the power and impact of a CEO is you want to go into workrooms and work meetings and conversations thinking, how can I take on more of the emotional load, rather than thinking, how can I take on as little emotional load as possible? In other words, you want to go in thinking, how can I be courageous and how can I be willing to ask the scary question or say the scary thing, rather than thinking, how can I avoid doing anything scary and how can I stay super comfortable? Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode and for tuning into the CEO Mindset, CEO Voice series. And if you want my support developing the confidence that is going to help you take on that emotional load, I want to invite you to come work with me in the Art of Speaking Up Academy. We spend the first 2 months of that program strengthening your mindset so that you can take on more of the emotional load in meetings. And as you watch yourself start to do that, you are going to feel so on fire and so unstoppable inside. If you are ready to develop the confidence you need to show up like a leader, to take on more of that emotional load, and if you want to do the work to sharpen your communication to an executive level, then you will love the curriculum in the Art of Speaking Up Academy, and I cannot wait to support you. Enrollment is open through July 2nd, and you can learn all of the details. You can see the entire curriculum, and you can submit your application by heading to jessguzikcoaching.com/academy. I will drop the link in the show notes, and if you've got questions about the Art of Speaking Up Academy, please feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the show notes as well, but it is just jessica@theartofspeakingup.com. I am so excited to read your application, and I will catch you in the next podcast episode. Bye.